talks. Next up is Kev with his talk entitled Don't Be Alarmed, but there's a synthesizer. I knew I was going to mess that up. Don't be alarmed, but there's a I can't say it. You take over.
Oh, thanks, Doug.
There we go.
I paid him to mess that up at the beginning there for me. Thank you very much, Doug. I have to apologise. It's a strange way to start a talk, I understand, but I have quite a serious, I have to start this talk on quite a serious note. That didn't really help, to be honest, Doug, but this is very serious. I don't want to come across as alarmist, but I have some frankly shocking news for you. There is a synthesizer living in your web browser. Now, I know what you're feeling right now because I've been there. I understand it, I really do. Don't panic. We can get through this, I promise. So, I was investigating this talk. This is how I found out about this. I was always going to do a talk on audio tech because that's my background, audio tech. I was always going to call my mate Chris. Look at lovely Chris there. He's beautiful, isn't he? Chris and I lived together for about 2 years, maybe more, maybe even 4 years. We probably wrote about 200 experimental dance tunes together. And I was lucky enough to help Chris prototype his weird and wonderful instruments, including the instrument he's sat in front of there, which, believe it or not, is a laser harp. This is the laser harp in action. And genuinely prototyping this instrument was amongst the most fun I've ever had in my life. It does everything you would expect it to and more. So it's actually velocity sensitive. The speed you put your hand through the light determines how loud the note will be. And it does exactly what you would think. When you put your hand through the light, it plays a note. But to be honest, that's actually not what's happening. What that is that's what's called a MIDI trigger device. And what the MIDI trigger device is doing is the MIDI trigger device is sending a signal to a soft synth. So just to clarify, a MIDI trigger device is just basically a device that takes a signal, depending on the trigger, and sends back 3 bytes of information. Byte number 1, on, off. Byte number 2, what note, 0 to 127. Byte number 3, velocity. So how hard have we hit it? How fast did we hit it? So it was natural that I was going to call lovely Chris because we've worked on so much together to talk about this talk. I think it's probably important to say this at this point, although it is, to be honest, a little bit of a side note. Chris, I think, looks like Andy Murray. But that's just a side note. So Chris said to me when I called him, he said, Kev, I know exactly what we're going to do. I know exactly what we can do. We can write this very elegant little JS file, and it will talk to the synthesizer that lives in your web browser. Now, at this point, we were in back end on boot camp, and information overload, revelation overload. It was pretty much too much for me to take at this point. There's a synthesizer in my web browser, Chris. And Chris said, no, just calm down. Calm down, Kev. There's a synthesizer in everyone's web browser. It's part of the Web Audio API. It's built in to your browser. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at a very basic build of a synth using the inbuilt classes and methods that come as part of the Web Audio API. The first thing we need to do is we need to dispel this myth. This is not what we're looking at. This is an old analog synthesizer. What we're dealing with is just a piece of software that's contacted by a MIDI trigger device like Chris's laser harp, like this. This is another MIDI trigger device, or conveniently, like this. This is a MIDI trigger device too. This one happens to look like a keyboard, and it's laid out and set up in such a way that even a terrible keyboard, and I'm not a keyboard player, I have to say, but even a terrible keyboard player like myself can hopefully play something at the end that sounds a little bit like a piece of music. Let's hope. But without further ado, we need to look at some code that hopefully works. I know everybody is probably salivating for code. I'm going to go down on one knee here. Have a look at some code. So we have a very basic HTML file here. The only significant thing about this HTML file is this line here, the source, which is pointing to working synth. Now that should give you an idea of some of the fun that Chris and I had. There was obviously a synth before working synth that didn't work. I'm going to be honest with you, this synthesizer is going to be one of the least inspiring things you've ever heard in your life. In fact, it just makes an annoying noise, but it does demonstrate how little code it takes to get a noise out of this synth. So, working synth. Let's have a look here. Working synth. So I'm going to just very basically talk you through what's going on here. Look, that's it. That's all it takes. That's the entire code to get this synth going. So first of all, we're declaring a couple of variables. We've got an event listener here, which is going to, on click, call the function allow audio. Allow audio is going to set up an audio context, which is just basically an environment in which sound can live. Then we're going to create an oscillator. An oscillator is just something that makes vibrations. It'll make the speaker vibrate. We can put various bits of information into the oscillator. In this case, we're going to put this piece of information in, the frequency value, 440 hertz. For pianists watching, that's a middle A. They'll desperately want to know that. Then we are going to connect our oscillator to our audio context, oscillator start, and hopefully we get a really annoying noise. Let's see. Click this button. Oh, 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 that's weird. It's changing. So what's happening there? It's getting louder and quieter. So basically what's happening is we create an audio context. It creates what we call a sine wave. Then when I click it again, it creates another one which overlaps. Now, sometimes these sine waves will line up like this and they'll get louder. In fact, it didn't do it for me, which is a big shame, but sometimes they'll actually mismatch and the sine waves can cancel each other out. So you can actually get silence, but that unfortunately didn't happen this time. So we clearly need a better synth than that. It's not very good, really, is it? We probably have some notes. Now, in order to get notes, we're going to have to contact another API. We're going to contact the Web Midi API, which will allow us to plug in our MIDI devices. So let's have a look. What shall we call it? Shall we call it, I know, Better Synth? And I knew it was called Better Synth, obviously. And here it is. Here is Better Synth. So a little bit more code here. We've got things that will make it switch on and offable. That's very nice. We have, this is essentially the code that we saw earlier, pretty much, more or less. This bit's quite interesting. We have dealing with MIDI success. So if we get a signal that's successful, we're going to call the function start playing MIDI input. If we get MIDI failure, we're going to console log an error that no one wants to see, please. Function start playing MIDI input. This is quite interesting. We have to iterate through all of the possible inputs that we could have, because basically there are loads of MIDI inputs and it has to decide which one sent me a signal. So we're going to iterate through that, and then based on that, we're going to call this function. This here, 0x90, that's byte number 1, that's on. So if on, we're going to use this fancy formula here, which will use the note number, and we'll also use that 440 to work out what all of the notes should be relative to the keys. So hopefully, fingers crossed again, this will work. When I press this, it makes an annoying noise. So you can see we have a little bit of a problem. We'll fix that. We'll turn this one off. So it's not the most inspiring synth in the world yet. I totally understand that. We need a final synth. So we need a number of things to happen with final synth. We need the note to switch off when I lift the key up. That would seem very simple, but it isn't simple at all, because what happens when you lift the key up, it turns all the notes off. So what we have to do is count the number of active notes, and when the number of active notes goes back to 0, it'll switch the note off. We want to add some texture to the sound, so we're going to turn the sine wave into a triangle wave, which will make the sound more textured. I'm going to add a little bit of glide, which will make us glide from note to note. We're going to add also something called an envelope. An envelope allows sound to ramp up and ramp back down. So instead of coming in at the top volume, it'll slowly slide in and slowly slide back down. So let's have a quick look at Final Synth, and we'll just talk you through that code a little bit. So here, this is just dealing with that problem of having to count the notes. Here, this is actually cheating an envelope. It's called create gain, but it does the same sort of thing as an envelope. We have our oscillator type triangle here. We're going to start our envelope at 0. And then at the bottom here we have, this is an example of hacky code when two very tired people are trying to stop a click. So don't look, I shouldn't even really be showing you that code. Don't look at that code because it's, oh yeah, we were very tired. So hopefully we can play something very simple using Final Synth. Fingers crossed, one last time. It won't make a noise this time. Ooh. Dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum da dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da da dum. There is a synth, there's a synth living in your web browser. Now, what do I want you to take away from this? Don't be afraid of the synth that lives in your web browser. We love MDN docs. Go and look at the Web Audio API. Embrace the synth that lives in your web browser. And of course, if you ever happen to have some bespoke MIDI needs, or you need some bespoke lighting installations or some sensory lighting installations, please contact my mate Chris, who looks a bit like Andy Murray. Thank you very much.